In the seaside town of Paynton, tucked along England's sleepy Devon coast, stands a building so out of place, so lavish, so improbable that it makes passers-by question their own sense of geography. Surrounded by modest British cottages, battered by the grey winds of the English Channel, rises a palace. Not just any mansion, but a miniature Versailles. Its grand porticos, marble balustrades, and formal gardens seeming teleported from 18th century France. And yet, no king or nobleman ever ruled from here. The man who built this strange and staggering edifice was not born to royalty, nor even to respect. He was born in a broken home in upstate New York and raised on the road. A runaway actor turned mechanical genius. His name was Isaac Merritt Singer, and this was his final, flamboyant performance. They called it Oldway Mansion, but among locals, it became known as something far more intriguing: the Sewing Machine Palace. It was both a monument to genius and a mausoleum for scandal. And the strange question that hangs in the sea air of Devon today is this: why is there a lost Versailles here? And who built it? Not out of royal wealth, but out of machines. If you're already captivated by this bizarre and tragic tale, pause for a moment. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more haunting histories and forgotten legacies. Drop a comment below with where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is right now where you are. We love seeing how far these hidden stories travel. And if you find this story as surreal as we do, share it with a friend who enjoys forgotten mansions and historical intrigue. Let's see who truly understands the mystery behind the title. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it's buried in the walls of empty palaces, and that's where our story begins. Isaac Singer, the man whose name would be printed in gold letters on millions of sewing machines worldwide, did not rise gently through the ranks of polite society. His was a story of chaos, contradiction, and theatrical self-invention. Though history textbooks hail him as a visionary inventor, this is a sanitized version of the truth. Before the sewing machine, there was the stage. Before success, there were women, many women. Born in 1811, Singer was on the move by age 12. Swept up in the rough and tumble world of traveling theater. He acted Shakespeare in dusty taverns, slept in haylofts, and argued for coins in frontier towns. But it was this very life, with its endless curtain calls and craving for applause, that shaped his soul. He never really stopped performing. When he stumbled upon an idea to improve the design of an early sewing machine, he didn't see a mechanical solution. He saw a ticket to the grandest stage in the world, society itself. By the 1870s, Isaac Singer had become one of the richest men on earth. His fortune was estimated at $14 million, an astronomical sum in the Gilded Age, equivalent to billions today. But money, for all its noise and shine, could not buy him entrance into the polished drawing rooms of Manhattan's elite. The doors of high society remained firmly shut, and the reason was whispered behind gloved hands and printed in scandal-hungry newspapers. Isaac Singer had at least 24 children by 5 different women, 2 of whom he kept simultaneously as wives. He was a bigamist, a polygamist, a man of appetites and indiscretions. When his legal wife finally discovered his double life, a spectacular public scandal erupted. The press tore into him like wolves. New York turned its back, exiled by disgrace. Isaac fled to Europe with a storm cloud over his head and a bottomless bank account in his pocket. He was 60, furious, and unrepentant. England would be his refuge, but not just any part of England. He chose Devon, a quiet corner by the sea, where he purchased the Furnham estate in 1871 and immediately declared his intention to build something outrageous. A home? No. A retreat? Hardly. What he envisioned was nothing less than a fortress of grandeur, a palace of redemption, a final thunderous act. He called it the Wigwam. The name alone was a slap in the face to every prim British sensibility. Imagine a wealthy American striding into a conservative village, erecting a mansion the size of a royal estate, and naming it after a Native American hut. But it was typical Isaac. He was not only building a home for his new lover. Isabella Boyer, a woman 30 years younger, French, impossibly beautiful, and rumored to be the muse for the Statue of Liberty. He was also making a statement to everyone who had ever mocked him. If they would not give him a crown, he would craft one himself. In marble, the design of the wigwam was a reflection of Singer's theatrical mind. The centerpiece was to be a colossal rotunda, a domed arena where he could ride and train horses indoors. Imagine it, a man in his 60s, demanding an equestrian ring at the heart of his mansion. The symbolism was stark. He wanted to remain in control, to tame wildness, even as age and scandal nipped at his heels. The construction was a spectacle in itself. Trainloads of Italian marble, tropical hardwood, French velvet, and gilded decor poured into Paynton like an endless stream. Local residents watched, half in awe, half in disgust. To them, Isaac was a creature from another world, a noisy, vulgar, gold-soaked Yankee who flaunted wealth without taste. And yet, the energy was undeniable. The project consumed thousands of pounds sterling weekly. The wigwam rose like a mirage. But fate, always cruelly poetic, had already written its twist. In the summer of 1875, mere weeks before completion, Isaac Singer's heart gave out. At 63, after a lifetime of thunderous noise and movement, he died suddenly, leaving behind an unfinished dream. His funeral was, as expected, a spectacle. A coffin made of cedar, lead, and English oak, so heavy it required several men to carry, was paraded through Devon in an 80-carriage procession. The locals who had once whispered behind curtains now lined the streets. The actor had taken his final bow, but what remained was a strange, half-finished monument to ego, grief, and defiance. The wigwam, enormous and expensive, now stood silent. Singer's family, scattered and warring over his inheritance, had no real use for it. The great palace had been built for applause, but the curtain had fallen before the performance began. Yet from the shadows of his legacy, a new figure emerged, one of his many sons, but the only one who seemed to truly understand what the mansion could become. His name was Paris Eugene Singer, and though he bore his father's name, he was molded by entirely different forces. Born in 1867 and raised in Europe, Paris had known luxury from the cradle. Where Isaac was fire, Paris was marble. Where the father was volume, the son was silence. The wigwam had been designed for show. Paris would soon remake it for beauty. But as Isaac's coffin was lowered into the soil of Torquay Cemetery, no one could yet imagine the fate awaiting the strange rotunda in Devon. Nor could they imagine that 30 years later, it would become a stage not for equestrian pageantry, but for one of the most devastating tragedies in artistic history. For now, the house slept, half Versailles, half circus tent, waiting to be reborn. And Paris Singer, the tall, blonde prince of a scandalous kingdom, was preparing to awaken it with a kiss of classical French order. The house his father built had always unsettled Paris Singer. He never called it the wigwam. He found the name ridiculous, crude, a relic of his father's theatrical vulgarity. To Paris, the rotunda at the center of the mansion, with its circular form and equestrian function, looked more like a circus tent than a home. It echoed the life he had worked so hard to transcend. Raised in Europe under the influence of his French mother, Isabella Boyer, Paris had grown up not among machines or schematics, but inside salons, galleries, and gardens. While Isaac Singer had ruled over steel and steam, Paris had been reared in a world of silk, oil paintings, and whispered Latin poetry. He spoke French before he spoke English. He walked the halls of the Louvre as a child. His soul longed not for invention, but for perfection. So when the estate passed into his hands, he made a decision that was equal parts architectural genius and psychological exorcism. He would not destroy his father's creation. He would entomb it inside something greater. By 1904, Paris Singer had bought out the shares of his siblings, taking full control of the estate. And then he called upon one of the most legendary figures in European landscape architecture, Achille Duchesne. Duchesne was no ordinary architect. He was a master of symmetry and illusion, known as the Prince of Gardens, who had worked on the restoration of the very grounds of Versailles. It was a deliberate choice. Paris wasn't hiring a builder. He was hiring a magician. With Duchesne's help, he would wrap the old rotunda in a grand neoclassical facade, hiding his father's brash legacy beneath layers of white stone, gilded cornices, and mathematical precision. The symbolism was chilling in its beauty. Isaac's energy would remain, but caged, controlled, polished. The wigwam would vanish into the folds of Versailles. The ambition was staggering. Dozens of stonemasons, sculptors, and gardeners descended upon Devon. French limestone was shipped across the channel. The hills around the estate were reshaped to conform to the rigid geometry of a formal French park. A colonnaded entrance was erected, echoing the Place de la Concorde. Where once wagons had delivered marble for a riding arena, now the land itself bowed to a higher order. Every hedge was clipped to perfection. Every pathway obeyed symmetry. The English countryside, wild and damp, was being forced to speak the language of the Ancien Régime. Inside, the transformation was even more radical. Paris ordered the construction of a new grand staircase, a hauntingly precise replica of the ambassador's staircase at Versailles, which had been destroyed centuries earlier. He resurrected it from old blueprints, marble by marble, as if defying time itself. The message was clear. Kings had torn down beauty, but a singer could bring it back. The ballroom was reimagined as a mirror gallery, complete with 17 arched windows on one side and 17 colossal mirrors on the other. The golden light of the Devon sun now danced endlessly between reflections, creating an illusion of infinite space, a corridor not just of opulence, but of eternity. But why? Why go to such staggering lengths? Why rebuild Versailles in exile? For Paris, it was about more than taste. It was about legitimacy. His father had amassed wealth that was powerful but tainted, born of scandal, and more scandal. Paris wanted something cleaner, more permanent. He didn't want to inherit wealth. He wanted to reforge the Singer name into something pure, timeless, worthy of history books. Versailles wasn't just inspiration, it was camouflage. The closer Oldway Mansion looked like something ancient and noble. The easier it would be to forget it was paid for by sewing machines and scandals. It was aesthetic alchemy, transmuting nouveau riche coin into old-world gold leaf. But even Versailles, however precise, is only a stage. And a stage is lifeless without its actors. The house, now nearly complete in its transformation, lacked a soul. Paris was a solitary figure, handsome, refined, but distant. What he had created was dazzling, but cold. The palace waited, its golden chandeliers glittering in silence, until a whirlwind in human form appeared on the horizon. Isadora Duncan. She was unlike anything Devon or Paris had ever seen. Barefoot, wild-haired, robed in Grecian tunics, she danced not for applause but for liberation. She rejected corsets, conventions, and concert halls. She danced in gardens, in temples, in the open air. Her performances were emotional storms, raw, transcendent, filled with a primal grace that seemed summoned from another age. Isadora wasn't an entertainer. She was a revolution in motion. And when she met Paris Singer in the salons of London, the collision was immediate and volcanic. Paris was captivated. She was everything he wasn't: chaotic, impulsive, vulnerable, radiant. She lit up his perfectly curated world like lightning on marble. And perhaps, to her, he offered something else: a sanctuary. A man who could protect her brilliance from the world's mockery. She called him Lohengrin, after Wagner's Night, a man she saw as a rescuer, a mythical figure drawn to her tragic beauty. He, in turn, saw her as a living goddess, a flame in need of a temple, and he had just the temple to offer. Oldway Mansion came alive. Imagine her dancing barefoot on the parquet floor beneath chandeliers meant for royalty. Picture her whirling down the grand staircase, her sheer silks catching in the breeze. The rooms, once echo chambers of ambition, now pulsed with breath, laughter, and music. Paris had finally found his queen. But if he hoped her presence would turn the mansion into a sanctuary of joy, fate had other plans. The relationship between Isadora and Paris was turbulent. She was as emotionally untamed as he was reserved. She brought with her 2 children from previous relationships, and soon, she and Paris had a son of their own, Patrick. For a brief, fragile moment, Oldway Mansion held something it had never held before: family, not legacy, not performance, but simple, messy, miraculous love. And yet, the gods of tragedy watched with interest. In 1913, during a visit to Paris, the unimaginable happened. A chauffeured car, an open automobile with a fault in its mechanics, rolled into the Seine River while the children were still inside. The driver had stepped out to hand-crank the engine. The brake failed. Isadora's daughter, Deirdre, and her son Patrick drowned together. The news tore through Europe. It was a scandal of cosmic cruelty, the kind of thing that seems invented by Greek playwrights rather than real life. And for Paris Singer, it shattered everything. He brought Isadora back to Oldway, hoping the beauty and calm of Devon might heal her. But the mansion, designed for triumph and show, could not contain grief. The mirrors that once multiplied golden light now reflected only hollow eyes. The gardens mocked their pain with perfect symmetry. Isadora wandered like a ghost. She hated the place. The house was a palace of lies, incapable of embracing sorrow. Paris tried to save her, but grief was too deep and beauty too shallow. The fairy tale unraveled, and yet, from this collapse came a strange and painful redemption. 1 year later, With the world sliding toward war, Paris would make a decision no one saw coming. He would open his palace not to kings or dancers, but to wounded soldiers. A house built for Versailles would become a hospital. The golden halls would echo with the cries of men torn by metal and mud. But that is a story for the next act. The Oldway Mansion had always been a palace out of place. But now it became a palace out of time. The transformation that Paris Singer had so carefully orchestrated, stone by stone, mirror by mirror, had reached its apotheosis. But in its gilded perfection, there was one element that Paris could never control: the human heart. When grief walked through its halls, even Versailles collapsed. Isadora Duncan did not recover. How could she? The river had taken both of her children in a single, absurd accident. Her daughter Deirdre and son Patrick, the very child she had shared with Paris, had been lost to the cold, uncaring current of the Seine. The chauffeur had only turned his back for a moment. A gear slipped, a brake failed, and the car rolled silently into the water, carrying the children to their deaths, while onlookers screamed helplessly. Even now, the tragedy feels too grotesque, too mythic to be real. It shattered Isadora, unmoored her from any sense of reality, and left her a drifting soul, untethered even from the art that had once defined her. Paris tried to be her anchor. He brought her back to Oldway, hoping that the symmetry of the gardens and the stillness of its corridors might offer some kind of balm. But it was a mistake, perhaps the greatest of his life. Oldway was never meant to comfort. It was meant to dazzle. The mirrors that once glorified beauty now reflected absence. The marble floors felt like tombstones. In the very ballroom where she once twirled barefoot with divine defiance, Isadora now dragged her feet like a sleepwalker. Nothing in the house could catch her anymore. Not even him. She became unpredictable, haunted. There were nights she wandered into the gardens and screamed into the hedges. Paris, a man of systems and elegance, tried in vain to structure her grief, to make it fit inside a gilded frame. But grief is not aesthetic. It is messy, brutal, shapeless. It doesn't follow the rules of symmetry or design. It eats through marble like acid through silk. And so their love, so bright, so improbable, withered, not from betrayal, not from anger, but from sheer, helpless sorrow. The tragedy that broke them also broke the house. From that point on, Oldway was no longer a stage for beauty or pageantry. It was haunted. The perfect geometry of its gardens, the endless reflections in its mirror gallery, the resurrected staircase from Versailles. They all began to feel like an elaborate illusion, a cruel stage set built for a play that ended in disaster. And yet, in this moment of personal collapse, Paris did something unexpected, something remarkable. As war loomed across Europe, he decided to surrender the palace. In 1914, when the First World War engulfed the continent in fire and blood, Paris Singer offered Oldway Mansion to the American Women's War Relief Fund. The building, once meant for princes and prima ballerinas, would become a hospital. No ceremony, no self-congratulation, just a quiet, deliberate act of transformation. The ballroom, with its gold moldings and mirrored grandeur, was stripped of luxury and filled with rows of iron beds. The Grand Rotunda, originally designed by his father as an indoor arena, was repurposed as a triage unit for wounded soldiers arriving from the trenches of France. The scent of beeswax and perfume was replaced with iodine, ether, and blood. The music of laughter and chamber quartets gave way to moans and whispered prayers. It was a surreal metamorphosis. The same stairs that had echoed with the light steps of Isadora's dances now carried stretchers bearing mangled limbs. The chandeliers no longer reflected ballroom gowns, but nurses in white rushing between rows of suffering. On the surface, it seemed tragic, even obscene. A palace degraded into a ward. But in truth, this was the first time Oldway Mansion served a genuine purpose. In saving others, it briefly saved itself. Paris funded the hospital largely from his own wealth. This wasn't philanthropy for reputation. He was too private, too ruined for that. This was penance. He couldn't save his own child, but perhaps he could save someone else's. Perhaps, somewhere in those corridors filled with pain and antiseptic, he believed that a balance might be restored. He was no longer the heir to a sewing empire or the prince of an artificial Versailles. He was a father in mourning, trying to make meaning from what remained. For Isadora, however, the mansion could never be redeemed. The weight of her loss became unbearable, and even Paris's attempts at healing through service could not bridge the distance between them. She drifted further and further from Oldway, and eventually from him entirely. Their love, so glorious in its ignition, burned out in silence. She returned to the stage, but she was never the same. Her dances, once radiant and fearless, now carried the heaviness of death. Every movement spoke of ghosts. In the years that followed, Isadora would live a nomadic life, chasing the remnants of art across Europe and Russia. Her final years were marked by scandal and further tragedy, and in 1927 she died in a manner as dramatic and bizarre as her life, strangled by her own scarf when it caught in the wheel of a moving car. The poet who danced barefoot across the marble floors of Oldway left the world in an absurd mechanical accident, as if the universe itself were echoing the twisted fates that had haunted her. Back in Devon, Oldway Mansion survived the war, but it would never return to what it had once been. The Belle Époque had ended. The golden age of empire, illusion, and aristocratic fantasy had crumbled under the weight of modern warfare, and so had Paris Singer's dream. After the war, he no longer had the heart to live in a place that reminded him of everything he had lost. He left England for good, retreating to the sun-soaked promise of Florida, where he tried to begin anew among palm trees and pastel villas. He helped develop Palm Beach, another illusion in another land. But it was never the same. Oldway stood empty, majestic, yes, beautiful, yes, but empty. Its soul had departed with Isadora. Its purpose had ended with the war. The Versailles of Devon was now a museum without visitors, a stage without actors. The mirror gallery, once built to multiply light and glory, now reflected only shadows and silence. Time began its quiet reclamation. Dust settled on the balustrades. Vines crept over the fountains. The perfection of Paris. Singer's vision faded into the grayness of English weather and memory. What remained was the echo of something once magnificent, once human, and now simply forgotten. After the Great War, Paris Singer did not return to Oldway. His departure from England was quiet, almost invisible, for a man who once tried to orchestrate every inch of his life with the grandeur of a monarch. His exit felt like a whisper. He had given everything he had, his love, his vision, his wealth, to a palace that no longer had a role to play. The world had moved on, and so did he. Palm Beach, Florida, became his new stage. There, under subtropical sun, He tried to build a paradise of resorts and gardens, but it was never quite the same. The memories were too heavy, and he never again attempted a monument on the scale of Oldway. In a way, he had already buried part of himself in Devon. Back in Paynton, the mansion stood like a marble ghost. It had once hosted whispered romances and mirrored elegance. Now, it echoed with emptiness. The gardens designed by Achille Duchesne grew wild. The carved cornices collected dust. No music played in the mirror ballroom. No feet danced on the mosaic floors. The house had been built for spectacle, for memory, for immortality. But like all things born of illusion, it was destined to fade. And then, the final insult came. In 1946, after years of neglect and uncertain ownership, the Paynton Council acquired Oldway Mansion. The price? $46,000. That's not a typo. A palace into which millions had been poured. By 2 generations, a French architect, hundreds of artisans, and the whispered prayers of a heartbroken dancer, was now sold for less than the cost of a London townhouse. The amount was not just insulting, it was symbolic. It represented history's indifference. It was the price not of legacy, but of liquidation. And what did the council do with this jewel of excess and grief? They turned it into an office, a municipal building. Clerks moved into the drawing rooms. Filing cabinets replaced sculptures. The mirror gallery, once lit by candles reflecting diamonds and silk, now flickered under cheap fluorescent bulbs. Paperwork was filed beneath ceilings painted to evoke imperial France. The scent of perfume was replaced with ink and stale tea. The Versailles of Devon had become a bureaucracy in marble. This was the fate Paris never could have imagined. He had built a temple to beauty, a fortress against obscurity. But time is relentless, and memory fragile. What had once been his defiant response to aristocratic rejection was now a forgotten artifact beneath the weight of office paperwork. And yet, perhaps this fate was fitting in its own cruel poetry. The mansion had been constructed as a grand illusion, and what better way for illusion to die than in fluorescent mediocrity? But decay is patient. As the decades passed, maintenance waned, budgets thinned. The once pristine stone began to crack, plaster peeled. The gardens, once an exact replica of royal symmetry, became battlegrounds for weeds and weather. Rainwater dripped into carved cornices. Mold crept across ornate ceilings. By the early 21st century, Oldway Mansion was no longer just ignored. It was at risk. Listed as a building in critical condition, it sat locked behind rusting gates, too expensive to restore, too historical to demolish. A paradox in limestone. Today, Oldway Mansion remains in limbo, a sleeping beauty without a prince. Restoration would cost tens of millions, and no one seems eager to pay. Developers dream of carving it into apartments or luxury spas. Preservationists fight for its soul. But the public, for the most part, doesn't even know it exists. It is too grand to forget, too obscure to remember. A contradiction set in stone. Yet the most haunting aspect of the mansion isn't its decay. It's what it represents. When Isaac Singer invented the sewing machine, he changed the world. He gave families, especially women, a tool that brought independence and dignity. His machines stitched clothes, dreams, and fortunes. They were simple, black, metal, and everlasting. Even today, a century later, Singer sewing machines sit in antique shops and attics across the globe. Some still work. Others are kept as heirlooms, All are remembered. But the palace his son built? That is remembered by almost no one. A few historians, a few locals, the occasional filmmaker or documentarian. But otherwise, the golden mirrors and Versailles stairs stand forgotten. This is the true contrast between utility and vanity. Isaac Singer, for all his vulgarity and scandal, left behind a legacy of service, a machine, a function, a future. Paris Singer, with all his elegance and taste, left behind a ruin, an illusion, a dream that cracked. And this contrast is not just historical, it is deeply modern. We are all, in some way, Paris Singers now. We curate our lives for beauty, for admiration. We filter, stage, and perform. We build digital palaces, Instagram grids, LinkedIn profiles, TikTok feeds, all carefully constructed to project success, control, perfection. But behind the mirrors, what do we leave behind? What remains when the followers disappear, when the apps vanish, when time reclaims the pixels? Oldway Mansion is a mirror, not the glamorous kind, but the kind that shows us what happens when we mistake appearance for permanence. It whispers through broken glass and crumbling stone. Only what serves others survives. So next time you pass by an antique shop and you see a Singer sewing machine, simple, black, practical, stop for a moment. Run your fingers along its cold metal. Think of the hands it helped, the clothes it stitched, the homes it supported. And then remember the palace, the one with golden ceilings and marble stairs, the one that tried to become Versailles and became an abandoned office instead. The machine still works. The mansion is dying. There, in that contrast, lies the final, silent judgment of history.